So in this video, we're going to talk about basic switch functions, or as I put in the outline, switches. How do they work? First, a bit of review, like I tend to do at the beginning of these deeper concept videos. A switch is a layer 2 or higher device that connects multiple devices similar to a hub. For the purposes of our discussion, we're only going to talk about layer 2 functionality in a switch. Now, the primary functions of a layer 2 switch is to maintain a MAC table, MAC being the Ethernet address or the media access control address, the layer 2 address. It uses this MAC table to send frames only to the end stations that they are destined for. And you might ask, well, how does a switch know? How does it know what workstation a particular frame is destined for? It populates this MAC table by watching the incoming Ethernet frames and remembering what port those frames are seen on. And I've got a little diagram here on the next slide, and it'll make a little more sense if you're more visual like I am. In short, the switch examines the frames that comes through it and forwards them to the destination device. And I've got forwards in bold here because that's one of those technical terms that we keep going on about. A switch is said to be in the forwarding state when it is actually processing frames and sending them on to their destination. And as we talk about switches more in depth, you'll hear me use the term forwards this frame, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. Now, there are three basic forwarding modes in any kind of network switch. We have the store and forward, the cut through, and the fragment-free forwarding modes. And we'll talk about the differences of those here on the next slide. Now, certain switches can change modes on the fly if needed. For example, let's say a switch starts out in store and forward mode, but after a little while it determines, well, I've not seen any errors come through on any of these ports. I'm just going to switch it to cut-through forwarding and speed up the network traffic that's going through the switch. So let's talk about these three forwarding modes. The first is the store and forward forwarding mode. In the store and forward mode, the entire frame is received in the switch, and the FCS, or the frame checksum, which you'll recall when we looked at the diagram of the layer 2 frame, the FCS is validated to ensure it's a good frame before forwarding it along to the destination device. Now, store and forward is the default operation mode for most Ethernet switches out there. When you get into some of the really high-end, low-latency switches, they may not use store and forward unless you specifically tell it. But most switches, if you were to go buy a switch off the shelf at Best Buy and hook it up into your network, it would be using store and forward mode. Store and forward introduces more latency or delay into the traffic path simply because it does have to receive the entire frame, look at the frame, run a checksum on it, and say, yes, this frame is good, it's destined for this MAC address, and I'm going to forward it out port 7, or whatever port it is. However, the trade-off for introducing this latency is that the switch is highly reliable, as in it won't forward out frames that it knows are bad because it checked the checksum and said, well, this frame is not any good, and so it just rejects the frame right there. Store and forward can also forward between different speed interfaces. Let's say your input interface is 100 megabit and the output interface is a 1 gigabit, or the opposite way around. Because it's looking at every frame that comes through, it doesn't necessarily have to match the speed on both sides. The next switch mode we'll talk about is the cut-through forwarding. With cut-through forwarding, the switch forwards the frame as soon as the destination MAC address is seen, which is about 16 to 20 bytes into the frame. Now, obviously, because the switch is not checking the entire frame, it does not introduce nearly as much latency, and so you will get quicker communications by a few milliseconds using cut-through forwarding versus store and forward forwarding. However, using cut-through forwarding, you have the ability to introduce bad frames into the network. Since the switch isn't looking at the checksum, it just says, well, you're supposed to go out port 7, I'm sending you out port 7, and it's up to the network card on the other end of the link to determine, hey, this is a bad frame because my checksum doesn't match, and tell the sending station, hey, you need to resend this particular frame. We'll continue on with our discussion of basic switch functions and look at the forwarding logic of your generic Ethernet switch in the next video.